Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Biosphere, Inland Delta. Okay, Biosphere, legendary Norwegian ambient producer Geir Jansen. I've reviewed this guy's entire discography in the past, and you can find links to all my previous videos on his work in the description. He's put out loads of classic ambient projects, we should know him well at this point. So most recently, I guess we've come off the heels of his last album, which came out in the beginning of last year, Shortwave Memories. That was one of his most well-acclaimed projects in quite some time, and marking his return to synth-driven material, echoing the classic ambient techno he put out way back in the early 90s. I also thought that project was very solid, certainly a step up from a lot of the loose, minimal sample-driven records that characterize a lot of his more recent catalog from the past decade. Even if, as far as my own personal enjoyment, it was more of a upper-middle tier record from him, with other older albums such as End Plants existing that I feel did that sound better. Though if anyone was holding that up as one of his absolute best, I could definitely see where those people are coming from. At this point, with how widely varied his sonic approach to making minimal ambient music has been over the past several years, it's hard to really know what to expect out of a full new album from him. The only description given for this latest project was that it was primarily made out of improvised performances on newly restored vintage keyboards. Actually, listening to that myself, definitely continues in the same lo-fi, synth-heavy direction that his last album went in. Though the structure of this one is way more languid and featuring far less in the way of actual beat work. As advertised, it's a project that feels improvisational, very free-flowing and open-ended and meandering, without really structuring any of its sounds or feeling like it's heading in any kind of determined direction. Between the slightly harsher synth-heavy sound of it and the lack of structure, Inland Delta definitely has the ability to set itself apart as its own thing in the wider Biosphere catalog, and doesn't feel like a repeat of any other projects he's done before, while also feeling like exactly the kind of thing that he would do. As for how much I actually enjoy the results, well, I did think it was generally nice, though it can absolutely be a bit hit and miss for me. Some tracks on here are really good and others are just kind of a drag. In this project's best moments, it's suitably captivating and can absolutely hit on a strong emotional note. In its worst moments, it can kind of fall in the background and turn into a slightly unpleasant drone. Definitely a project that leaves me very torn. I'll talk about the good first. There's a bunch of tracks here which combine those harsher synth drones with some delicate piano performances, and those are nearly always big highlights. A track like Franklin's Dream runs on for over 8 minutes and steadily switches off between its oily synth pads sitting around like a middle baritone range, and some very peaceful major key piano chords. While that dream-like vibe it creates might be one that you get while you're sick, either with a fever or upset stomach, the actual contents of the dream are interestingly pleasant. The way these elements come together doesn't feel like they should match as well as they actually end up doing, and it's quite possibly the most striking and memorable cut in the bunch here. Other tracks, especially near the end of the project, like The String Thing and Jane's Lament, build upon this track's ideas by introducing all these synth string pads, the timbre of which definitely resembles the pads you'd hear on Biosphere's first 2 albums, but are being played in a very different way that makes them feel a lot more eerie and cinematic, like movie soundtrack strings or something. And when the pianos come in on either of these tracks to fill out the mix, it once again really furthers a deeper emotional core, making a track that might otherwise be mildly unnerving in its isolation instead feel more heartbreaking. On top of that, there's a couple of tracks here which end up having a little more of a pulse to them. A track like Wolfgang's Wave forms a beat out of its wobbling synths and has all these almost synthwave-ish pad melodies floating over it, and it ends up very nice. But more pressingly, there's the track Delta Function, which brings in actual percussion. Even if it may not be much more than metallic tapping, it still has more of a groove than any other track here. And the way all the burbling bass flips and almost Mellotron-ish melodic pads wrap around it make this track quite possibly the single most satisfyingly full-sounding cut out of anything else that appears here. Any of these above-mentioned tracks don't give me much of anything to complain about, and if you are a longtime Biosphere fan, they will definitely make the album worth hearing on their own. With that said, as we all know by now, Biosphere likes to get more minimalistic with his compositions on average, and the more stripped back and simpler cuts on this thing also tend to be the ones I'm drawn to the least. Finding a similar middle ground between pleasantness and unpleasantness that ends up feeling less to my taste, I guess. The warping filtered pads on opener surface tension, the aimless layers of various keyboard melodies on Brownian motion that never seem to come together until they're given a bit more of a direction on following track Random Walk, which makes those sounds feel almost more evil and foreboding. Tracks like these are certainly all nice and are able to hit on the emotions they're going for, but they kind of hit on a similar note for me to projects like Clark's Playground in a Lake, in how despondent and listless they can often feel. Not to mention those latter two just seem to drag on for much too long for their own good. Not that this project was much of a feel-good listen to begin with, but cuts like those just really bring down my mood and end up doing more to water down the vibes my favorite tracks here could hit upon. There's also the track Florian's Flute, which I do like more than all three of those, but it kind of just feels like an interstitial transition moment to bridge the ideas of the string thing and Jane's Lament, without doing anything to really stand out in its own right. So yeah, all of that leaves me very torn on Inland Delta as a whole. Again, the good moments on this thing are really good, and the less moments I can at least see the appeal of and don't think they're poorly executed for what they're going for. As of yet, I've seen pretty much all positive buzz for this album, and I feel like I would get it if this ended up standing as one of your favorite projects from him in a while. I, however, only really liked certain moments of it and didn't come out at the end of it with as much of an urge to return to it more in the future. If I were to place it in the ranking of all his albums, I'd say I enjoyed this more than his Angel's Flight album. There definitely felt like there was more to chew on with this one, and those couple of standouts, especially Delta Function and Franklin's Dream, made it still worth the experience, where that project mostly just ran together and I don't really remember much about. But I would also put this lower than Potashnik. That's another album I mostly find to be kind of hit and miss, but I feel like that one's high points are markedly higher. Like, the handful of best tracks on that project are like all-time 90s ambient techno classics, and the handful of best tracks on this project are just really good. So take that all as you will. This is neither his best or his worst. It's definitely not among the most essential stuff he's ever put out, more of a lower middle tier project coming from him in my eyes. But I've also heard him put out plenty of projects that give me a lot less to connect with than this. Even the worst moments here give me at least something tangible I like to latch onto, which isn't something I can say about all his albums. And I'll take the best moments on this thing as they come, so I think all of these conflicted feelings average out to me thinking this thing is merely pretty good, so I'm feeling like a very light, solid 7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.